Yeah, it's an interesting subject, and it's something that our team here at Darkness Rises talks about frequently. And my perspective is that yes, it was time consuming, but maybe it wasn't just there to mess with you and to waste your time. I feel that it was kind of a test to the player a little bit because auto rollers, obviously within that system, the auto
Mhm.
rollers made it so that you could avoid all that and that you could have optimal stats more or less.
Right.
But the thing that I remember most is you were making sacrifices. So if, especially in the early days where there weren't any auto rollers, you had to sit and contemplate 17 agility versus 18, or 10 in wisdom, and the rest were all good. So
Yep.
do you feel that there's still kind of some hope in maybe having that system, but maybe making it so that, say, like 10 is the lowest that you could roll?
Yeah. So like have a limited number of retries that you can have. I think that would be interesting, because then basically any system is fine as long as you can ensure that everybody has the same chances. Um, I think you can get that with a limited number of retries and just fixing the algorithm so that it just it also doesn't provide you with the ability to end up with magically 419s or whatever, 418s. Um, I think that's interesting. I think with allocation, you can get that too because you only have so many points to spend, so you have to decide. But then obviously the problem with allocation is someone will figure out the best min max, right? And again, you'd be stupid for rolling anything but this specific combination. Um, it's not an easy question. Definitely, I think it definitely deserves a lot of thought. So I'm glad you guys are thinking about it.
Yeah, of course. Moving on, is there any event from, say, Darkness Falls or DFC that sticks out to you as your favorite? Maybe one that you experienced or one that you wrote?
Um, well, from the ones that I wrote, obviously, some were definitely more of my favorite than others. There was one particular one, I believe it was like the Formian or Formican invasion, where we had like these ants start tunneling up out of the major cities, and then players had to like go into the tunnels and kill the things, and then the tunnels started collapsing, which was fun because I got all the staff members that were helping me to download this macro program. And then, so basically, we wrote these macros that would start deleting rooms and fixing like descriptions and stuff. And then, if we accidentally like abandoned players in rooms, we would have to manually teleport them out and stuff. And then, of course, people that had logged out in the tunnels for whatever reason got stranded for days because staff wasn't on to get them out. And it was a huge mess, but it was also a huge amount of fun. It was probably one of the most involved things that I did. That was a lot of fun. Um, Before that, like as a player in Darkness Falls originally, I just remember my first invasion that I experienced. I was level 10 and I was out in the grasslands, and I'm like, oh, whatever, killing, just hunting, killing stuff, and then all these monsters spawned on me and just destroyed me, and I had no idea what was going on. Um, so I got to experience that for the first time. And some very nice players, just cleared the room and dragged me to the hole and resurrected me, and I was just listening in awe as my guild members were talking about the loot and stuff. Total noob.
As we all were at one point. So Nix has a question about wolves. First off, who was Razzie and what were their changes to wolf form?
I'm not sure, unless he means Rashka. Um, Rashka had the most input into the late wolf forms. Actually, I think it was the work for wolf forms were Razi, right? Okay, sorry, I remember. Man, so many staff members over the time. Um, Razi was the implementer. The initial changes around wolf forms began with Melisana and Vertumnus. Started monkeying with that, and then Razi kind of did some changes. I don't think I remember what those were. The biggest problem with wolf forms was that when you shapeshifted, you were basically a monster. You were a creature, and as we've discussed, or as I've mentioned, just there was no way to balance monsters for player to combat players of higher than level 50. Like there just wasn't. Their settings could only really go so effectively high, you know. So what they ended up doing was the whole like shock and elemental attack stuff, and that only got us so far because their accuracy was still just kind of more or less garbage. Um, so I think Rashka was doing some work to try to address that, and I backed her on that as best I could from what we understood of the mechanics at the time. But it was very difficult. It was a very difficult thing to do. Um,
So, would you say that the wolf form problem was indicative of the overall code in Darkness Falls,
Absolutely,
being
it
bad?
it was an engine problem. Just like martial arts was an engine problem, and breath weapon was an engine problem, because those things were all created to scale with invisible numbers. Like we had no idea the what the actual like formula was for that, or what the variables were behind that stuff. So like you'd get to the high level monks were suddenly unhittable because I think at some point past 50, like that scaling just made no sense anymore. um, I wish One of the things that always bothered me was never knowing what those variables really were. Like, was it purely based on level? Did the skill actually have actually factor in? It seemed like it was a combination of skill and level. um, but the scaling on that stuff and on monster settings was just broken.
Um, how strong was the evidence that skills like melee and berserk were capped at a lower level, while the actual weapon training was what really mattered?
I think it started to become really obvious as people started to hit level 65, 70. um, I don't know that it was a capping problem as much as it was like it almost seemed like some skills would overflow to the point where after they got past a certain level, it's like whenever the game factored in their success in whatever formulas happened, um, like those numbers would like overflow into a low number, um, because then you got things like hide, hide and sneak were suddenly useless because uh, percept would suddenly like people with 150% could suddenly auto discover people with like 400% hide, which was ridiculous. And the drain had the same problem because eventually those vamps had like extra trains in drain. I don't know if you remember this. One of the rebuilds that happened was that like because they tried to boost drain because it was ineffective, but then I think they went too far, and then suddenly drain was again just not good. Um, so I think we had pretty strong evidence, but it was circumstantial. Like there was no way to prove it, obviously.
Then another question about stat points, kind of away from rolling the character. What are your thoughts on having kind of including them in the experience of leveling up?
How do you mean? Sorry.
I guess they were meaning to say, adding or earning stat points
Oh, I see.
onto your base stats as you leveled up.
Sure. Obviously, that question needs a lot of context, right? Like, what is on your gear? Like, are we talking like gear where like wow it increases your stats, or is gear still just protection and stuff? Like, if your gear only provides protection and attack power, and then the occasional buff spell, exactly like DFC, then I think being able to raise your stats is an interesting idea. But I think you would probably not have as many like stat boosting spells in that case, because then you really want to focus on making that choice matter, right? Um, I think it's a great idea, though. I think it could work.
Okay, and then how about I believe it's in a small area or a sub area called Home for the Headsick. Do you remember this area and why was it never used?
Wow, I don't remember that. Actually, so there were some areas, there were some blocks that staff confiscated um, for like their own little private dens, dens of uh, uber importance, I used to call them. Um, that might have been one of them, but I don't remember. That name doesn't ring a bell.
I believe he says it's in Eastern Tamia. It's in within the center of the city.
Hmm.
There's some like building or kind of warehouse, kind of abandoned place, maybe.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I don't know. That might have been. There were some interesting things in DFC that were there since Darkness Falls, especially in Evil. Just that carried over when they did the copy of that realm that are just interesting little artifacts for the rest of time.
Um, well,
Yeah, Son of Trump kind of mentioned the same. I suspect it was a DF1 thing that just never happened.
so how about we'll kind of look at some skills here. For the monk skill counter,
Counter.
did you feel that this was a viable option for DFC? Was this too strong, or was it, could it have worked?
Oh man, counter was special. Um, I don't honestly know what the point of counter was. The short answer is no. I don't think it was ever a good skill whatsoever. Because it allowed them to do too many things. Like as far as I remember, like they could drop stuff, pick stuff off, even eat stuff while they were countering. Um, and they're never, at least again, it might have just been a scaling problem, so that the higher level monks could just do it for days. Um, but in practice, the way it ended up working in DFC, I don't think it was ever really a good skill to have around. Um, yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. Do you feel that, in say, Darkness Rises, or just in
Hmm.
general, that do you think it fits with the monk class? Do you feel that you knew enough about the monks, or just any class in general, to kind of comment on that kind of specific skill?
Yeah, I think it was an interesting skill because it kind of did for monks what ball spells did for wizards, and casters in general, in that it allowed them to basically AOE things, that were aggroing them. Um, so I think it could work, um, but I think it needed some more penalties, or maybe even more control. Give the player more control over what they're countering. Um, so it definitely needs more checks and balances to it, but I think it could be a viable skill with some careful thought.
I have another question here that was asking about martial arts in
Hmm.
general. I know you mentioned that it was one of those skills that scaled kind of unknowingly.
Yeah.
Um, was there anything else maybe that you remember about maybe martial arts specifically that was an issue?
Um, no, I actually really liked monks. I when in my quest to make level 30 characters with everything, I really enjoyed my time as a monk. I will say part of that was that they were one of the only guilds to still have like a quest, like a guild quest for their claws, to get the sigil claws, um, which of course made a huge difference in the experience. Um, I think the biggest problem with monks was that they were pretty much invasion ready at all times, which was obviously a big plus. Um, but other than just kind of the weird defense scaling that ended up happening with martial arts, I think it was a pretty cool concept.
And then regarding the claws, I definitely remember those. I actually made a couple monks myself, whistle. Um, and, the claws themselves, they weren't really tied to anything but